Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, I'm going to take a few questions. I'll start off with some questions from the media and then perhaps take a couple of questions from the wider audience. Laura.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News. What you describe as hard facts could also be described as compromises, many of which seemed obvious many months ago. Do you accept now that we can't have it all as we leave? And secondly, you've outlined today you want to pick and mix, even though the EU has repeatedly rejected that approach. What is it, do you think, you can say to your EU leaders that will actually change their minds?
Well, first of all, what I've set out today is what I believe to be the right Brexit deal for Britain. But also, I believe it's the right deal for the European Union. And I'm confident that as we come and sit down together, we will be able to show that mutual interest and mutual benefit from the proposals that I've put forward. The European Union itself, in its own guidelines, as I said in my speech, has said that they want an ambitious, wide-ranging relationship and agreement and deal with the United Kingdom for the future. And I've set out in my speech the various areas in terms of the economic partnership where we want to sit down and talk to them about what that future relationship would be. But as I say, I'm confident that we will achieve the right Brexit deal for Britain because I believe that deal is also the right Brexit deal for the EU. Robert.
Robert Peston, BBC. Prime Minister, millions of people voted, to coin a phrase, to take back control. But today you have said that in order to maximise frictionless, low-cost trade with the EU, you will promise not to exercise the control you're taking back. So what can you say to those people who voted for Brexit was the point of Brexit?
Well, people voted to take back control of our money, our laws and our borders, and that's exactly what we will be doing. Yes, there are some areas where, and ultimately, Parliament will always be sovereign, and it will be Parliament that will make these decisions. There are some areas, as I've set out in the goods description of goods, where, from an economic point of view, businesses say it makes sense for us to operate on very much the same basis, so that we can continue that good trading relationship. But the decision on those rules, of course, will be for Parliament. Yes, as I said in my speech, there will need to be some binding commitments, as there are in any trade agreement. In any trade agreement, you sit down and you work out what rules both sides are going to operate on, particularly on issues like, as I've said in here, on competition and state aid. That's what we'll be doing in negotiating this trade agreement. But we will be taking back control of our borders. Free movement will end. We will be taking back control of our money. We won't be sending vast sums of money to the European Union every year in perpetuity. And we will be ensuring that we take back control of our lords, and Parliament will make decisions. Faisal.
Faisal Islam, Sky News, Prime Minister. On customs, a specific question and a more general one. Is the customs partnership option now the #1 option? It was described as a blue skies option, I think, by the Brexit Secretary a few months ago. And I think the head of customs said it could take 5 years to put these types of systems in place. Would we stay in the customs union in the interim? More generally, you say this is about bringing the country back together. But you described those people that want to reform a customs union as betraying the vote. There are people from the CBI here. There are members of your own party. How does that help when you say that that betrays the vote?
What I've set out today in my speech, and we have set out previously as a government in more detail, is two options for what we believe is a customs arrangement that would enable us to both trade, develop our own independent trade policy and trade deals with other countries around the rest of the world, but also ensure we have as frictionless trade across the border as possible and resolve that issue of ensuring we have no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. What I want to do now, and as I said in my speech, that I agreed with the Taoiseach when I saw him in Belfast recently, that we will be sitting down with the Irish government and the Commission to discuss the details of this. We want to explore those options with those partners so that we can ensure that we really go into them and develop the solution that is right, that delivers that no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, as frictionless trade as possible between the UK and the rest of the European Union, and continue to develop our own independent trade policy around the world. I think that those are what the majority of people actually want us to achieve, and we've set out ways in which we can do just that. Tom.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Tom Newton-Dunn from The Sun. You've said you're going to be patient. You said you won't walk out, or you won't threaten to walk out. But what if you don't get what you want? What if you don't get anywhere near what you want? Is no deal still a possibility? Is no deal still, or is no deal still better than a bad deal? And if so, will you repeat that now?
Yes, I've said before, I've said on many occasions that no deal is better than a bad deal. What I said in the very beginning of my speech is that one of the complexities as we go through this is we're not only negotiating on that future partnership, but we're also ensuring that we're preparing for all possible outcomes, because it is a negotiation. And that's only the right and sensible thing for us to do. But I'm confident, as I say, that I am confident in reaching a good deal, in reaching the right deal, because I believe that right deal is in the interests of both the United Kingdom and the European Union. I see Jason.
Thank you. Jason Groves from the Daily Mail. Some of your colleagues have been seeking sort of full autonomy over our laws after we leave. You're suggesting that's one of the... That may be impossible. That's a hard fact they'll have to swallow.
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear the question, Jason.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
We're working. Some of your colleagues have suggested they want full autonomy over the UK's laws. You seem to be suggesting that won't be possible. And some of your colleagues in Cabinet see this as a bottom line, this speech that you've given today, rather than an opening position. Is it your bottom line, or could there be more hard facts to swallow in the future?
When we look at the question of taking back control over our laws, it's very clear that Parliament will be sovereign, and it will be Parliament that will be determining our laws. I set out in my speech there are certain circumstances, as other countries have followed. If you look at the United States on the Safe Harbour framework, for example, they had an agreement with the European Union, but the European end of that, the EU end of that, is determined by the ECJ, and the ECJ took a decision that affected that agreement, but they came to another agreement. So what I was setting out was that the ECJ will still continue to have responsibility and a remit within the European Union, but the EU laws and the ECJ will no longer have jurisdiction in the UK, and it will be Parliament that will be making these decisions about our future. Anushka.
Thank you. Anushka Rastana from The Guardian. Prime Minister, you've admitted that there are going to be some difficult decisions and trade-offs ahead. And I think that makes it very important for us to understand what your priorities are, particularly among the 5 tests, one of which is prosperity. So what I want to ask is, if in the end, negotiating a customs union with the European Union is shown to be the best way to protect the economy, in that situation, would British jobs trump new trade deals after Brexit?
What I set out in the 5 tests is the 5 tests that we will be setting when we look in these negotiations at the future partnership. And it is those 5 tests that I set out at the beginning of my speech that will have determined the approach that I've set out today and will determine our future negotiations. I've explained that when we leave the European Union, we want to be able to make those trade deals around the rest of the world. I believe there is a way, as I've set out in my speech, in which it is possible to come to a customs arrangement which enable us to have as frictionless a border as possible, to ensure there's no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, and be able to have negotiate those trade deals around the rest of the world. Now, I thought I would take a couple of journalists not from UK media. I think, is Kirsten here from Handelsblatt?
Hello, Kerstin Leitl from German business daily Handelsblatt. You seem to prepare your people for quite difficult decisions and say there will be ups and downs and prepare them for limited access to the customs union. You don't want to be part of the customs union. Do you think Brexit is all worth it?
Look, if that was an attempt to say, will we think again on Brexit, the answer is no, we won't think again on Brexit. The British people voted for Brexit. And I think it is incumbent on their politicians to deliver on the decision that we asked them to take. Parliament overwhelmingly voted for this to be a decision of the British people, and I think it's right, them having taken that decision, that Parliament and politicians now deliver on that. What have I done today? Unlike some politicians, I'm actually being straight with people, because there are choices to be made. There are some hard facts to be faced. I've set out, though, what I believe is an economic partnership alongside the security partnership that I set out in my speech in Munich a couple of weeks ago that will ensure that we deliver for the British people on that referendum result, but at the same time we have an arrangement, we have an agreement, we have a deal that is right for the British people in terms of our prosperity, but also right for people across the European Union in terms of their future prosperity as well. And I think, is Sonia here from Libération?
Sonia de Le Salle-Stolper from Libération, French newspaper. Prime Minister, you've just repeated about Northern Ireland, you just repeated your red lines, no custom union, no single market. Isn't it time you tell the truth to the British and to the Europeans that there will indeed be a border in Northern Ireland, being a light border, high-tech border, but there will be a border in Northern Ireland?
We've been very clear there will be no hard border in Northern Ireland. And as we've said previously, that we will not be returning to the borders of the past. What I've set out in my speech today is ways in which that can be achieved. I'm pleased that we've now agreed with the Taoiseach that the Irish government, the UK government and the Commission will now be sitting down to work through those options that have been proposed and to be working through them in detail. I'm very clear we will not be returning to a hard border in Northern Ireland, between Northern Ireland and Ireland, and we will be ensuring that we also maintain the common market of the United Kingdom and that there's no hard border down the Irish Sea either. Now, I said I would take a couple of questions from the audience. I think, is Mike Cherry here from the FSB? Yes, Mike, sorry, I thought I'd seen you, sir.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Prime Minister. Small businesses will very much welcome your views around mutual recognition, and you also mentioned some sectors. But with over 40% of FSB members looking to grow their own business through global exports and needing certainty, what is your message for them today as Prime Minister, please?
Well, my message for them is that, first of all, we want to continue to get a good trade deal with the European Union, but we want to make sure that they can expand those export markets around the rest of the world as well. And that's why the Department for International Trade is working already, talking to a number of countries around the world about what our future trade arrangements might be. But I'm also clear that we want to find ways of helping and encouraging more small and medium-sized enterprises to export around the world and to the EU, but also around the rest of the world. I was very pleased to take some SMEs with me on my recent trip to China, for example, and I think they had some very good results from the networking, from the contacts that they were able to make there. And as a government, through DIT, through the work of export finance, guarantee, and so forth, we are working actively to encourage and help not just large companies, but also small and medium-sized enterprises be able to trade outside of the United Kingdom, be that to the European Union or indeed to other countries around the world. Thank you. And Jane Ann? Sorry, from Virgin.
Thank you. Thank you, Prime Minister. Yes, Jane Ann Gardia from Virgin Money. Prime Minister, I live in Scotland and I run a business in Newcastle, and I wonder how your vision of Britain after Brexit really improves things for people that live in both of those places and in other cities around the UK.
Well, it's First of all, the important thing, I would say, is keeping the United Kingdom such that we have the ability for you to live in Scotland and run a business in Newcastle. I think as we look outside of the United Kingdom, which is outside of the European Union, it's not just about what I've been talking about today, our future relationship with the EU. It's not just about the trade relationships around the rest of the world. It's about how we develop our economy here in the United Kingdom. And that's where the industrial strategy is an absolutely key part of what we're doing. We are a nation of innovators. We're a nation of, we're hugely creative. We're world leaders in so many areas. If you look at what we're doing in fintech, for example, if you look at what we're doing in artificial intelligence, if you look at what we're doing in the automotive industry, in a huge range of areas, we're out there leading the world. We want to ensure we're creating the environment here in the UK to enable people to continue to do that, to make real successes in across industrial sectors and the financial sector as well, but also creating the environment in which new innovation can come forward, and we can ensure that we're making the best of that too. And part of that, of course, also is getting our people skilled up so that they can actually take those jobs of the future. Thank you.
There we are, Theresa May setting out her road to Brexit at Mansion House, the sixth of those series of speeches. Listening in with Sky's political correspondent Tom Rayner, who's at Mansion House for us. Tom, bring us the headline news. What was the new things that we learned about?
Well, what we heard is Theresa May set out how she thinks she can deliver an economic partnership with the European Union after Brexit that maintains as frictionless trade as possible across both the Irish border but also with the EU more generally. And she went into quite a lot of detail there. That is the detail perhaps that people have been saying they wanted. But I think what will be also noted in that speech is that she delivered quite a vivid and quite a clear account of the problems that Brexit presents. The first half of the speech almost was explaining quite why it is not a straightforward thing to deliver. There was a pointed barb towards Brexiteers like Jacob Rees-Mogg, who, for example, on the Irish border have suggested that the UK could unilaterally just decide not to enforce it. She said that was not a credible proposition and that the UK has responsibilities because it is choosing to leave. So it's not credible to simply say that the UK would choose not to enforce it. And she said that there were a number of hard truths that she was prepared to say and that life was going to be different after Brexit. Now, when she got into the detail of what she was proposing, there were a number of interesting things that were put forward. Chief among them, the idea that there might need to be binding commitments with regards to the trading of goods, for example, on regulations to ensure that frictionless trade, or at least trade that is as frictionless as possible. Now, she said that that could not be under ECJ jurisdiction, but proposed an arbitration mechanism, something where there would be means for dialogue and means for consultation between the EU and the UK. She proposed specific arrangements for data protection and also the idea of associate membership for certain EU agencies like the European Medical Agency, conceding that the UK would be prepared to pay into those bodies and to observe the rules of those bodies in order to maintain access. Things like aviation, another example given. On services, which is of course slightly different, she said that within the free trade deal that she wants to seek, that it should be realistic that services could be included. She says that the idea that the Canada model doesn't include them doesn't mean that there shouldn't be one in any UK-EU trade deal. And she reiterated the point that she made in the Florence speech, which was neither the Norway model or the Canada model suited the UK. And she hit back at the claims made by Michel Barnier and Donald Tusk, where they have said that there can be no cherry picking. She said if that's the case, then no free trade negotiation that's ever taken place in the world would have happened, because all free trade arrangements involve some degree of cherry picking, some selection of areas where there will be mutual decisions. So it was quite a detailed speech. A lot will be gone through. There were certain areas which will certainly anger her Brexiteers within her own party. They will be very, very nervous of phrases like binding commitments on rules and regulations. Theresa May's response when some of that was put to her in the question and answer session was to say that in the end Parliament will be sovereign, and while there will be these binding commitments, Parliament could of course choose to change those commitments if it wanted to, but that would of course incur changes to market access. So she has set out a detailed proposition here. The problem is that many of the points that she made were incremental developments of what she has already said. They were incremental developments on where we were from Lancaster House just over a year ago, that speech, to the Florence speech in September. What, though, has been the one common response from the European Union to each of those propositions? It has been to say that that is simply not workable. We will look to see how Brussels respond to that speech.
Tom, thanks. Let's try and find out what the reaction is. Sam?
Yes, indeed. Let's go straight to Brussels. Our Europe correspondent, Mark Stone, is there. Mark, Theresa May's speech, she talked about the EU position, said there are tensions in the EU position, and also said, with this negotiation, neither of us can have everything we want. So how is that going to be read over there?
Contrary to what people might think, her previous two big speeches, the one in Florence and prior to that the one at Lancaster House in London, were both received pretty well by the EU. Although they thought that both speeches lacked significant detail, in terms of their overarching direction and the way in which they signposted the direction that Britain appeared to be going in, they were key moments, not just for the British government, but for the EU as well. And I think this speech will be seen in the same vein, although I still think it leaves many unanswered questions, not least on the issue of the Irish border, which she still hasn't outlined a solution to that. And I think the reason she hasn't is quite simple. It's because she knows, as well as anyone does, that you cannot finally solve the Irish border conundrum until you know what sort of a relationship you're going to have with the EU once we've left. And that is why it goes back to the very beginning, why Britain always said it wanted all the negotiations to happen at once. And they never got their way on that. They agreed to it being in sequence, and I think that was probably they would see that now as a mistake, agreeing to that. But so at the heart of the issue, the Irish border, there was nothing more in this speech on that. But on many other issues, I thought certainly there was a lot more meat on the bones than we had. Both in Lancaster House and in Florence. There hasn't been any official reaction yet from the EU. I've just been trawling through the Twitter feeds of the more active Twitter users in the EU. It's worth saying that they're moving around at the moment. The key people on Brexit. Michel Barnier, the EU's Brexit negotiator, is on a 2-day trip to Denmark, where he's meeting the Danish the Danish government. Of course, Denmark is a key trader with the UK. It might be one of those countries which wants Britain to get a better deal. It might be one of those countries that is more lenient with Britain, wanting to push Michel Barnier to perhaps go for that bespoke arrangement that Mrs May was talking about. But she did quite clearly rule out the idea of either going for a Canada model or a Norway model. She's pushing once again that she wants a bespoke model. I think some will return to that phrase we've used so many times, is she having her cake and eating it?
Mark, thank you. Let's get more now on our top story. The Prime Minister, Theresa May, has been setting out her Brexit stance in a speech delivered at Mansion House. Well, let's speak to John Rentoul now, Chief Political Commentator from The Independent, and also Philip Blond, Director of Res Publica. John, first of all, to you, did she do enough with this speech, do you think?
Well, we're at a very early stage of the most difficult part of the negotiations, so we don't know. It was an extremely detailed and thorough speech. Some might say very dull in parts. It sounded like a commercial law lecture in international trade, some of the finer points of it. But politically, what was significant in terms of domestic politics, I think, given the alignment of forces against her in the House of Commons on the question of whether Britain should be in a customs union with the EU, where she is threatened with defeat in the House of Commons. She maintained quite a hard line on that. She didn't repeat what she said in the Lancaster House speech last year, which was that she might be seeking an associate membership of the EU Customs Union. She was going to seek associate membership of all sorts of agencies, but not of the Customs Union. Her solution to the customs problem in Northern Ireland was just the same as before. It is technology and basically ignoring what smaller businesses and smaller traders get up to. So, you know, she hasn't resolved that problem, and she's going to have to face a majority against her in the House of Commons at some point.
Philip Blond, on to you. What's your view? Has she done enough domestically to shore up her position? John Rentoul says not.
I think it's unclear. I think it was her most successful European speech. I think she created a whole series of concessions. I think she made a very, very good point that all free trade agreements are bespoke, and all she wants is a bespoke agreement. And I think your correspondent, Lewis Goodall, put it very well, where he said that Theresa May is trying to invent the institutions of soft Brexit and make them bespoke without entering the customs union or the single market. So in a way, what she's trying to do is steer a very effective middle course by having, and I agree with Lewis on this, having the institutions of soft Brexit, but because they're negotiated on a bespoke level, nobody can accuse her of selling out. And across a range of points, she said we're going to have mutual recognition, binding agreements. She's said there will be a transitional arrangement. That's something the Brexiteers will be very concerned by. And by this insistence upon deep and strong equivalence between the EU regulations and the UK regulations, it's hard to see quite what Brussels can disagree with. And I think in a way she's put it back in the EU's court, and I think it's very successful because it looks like she's got more than Labour's offer, because the danger Labour have is they're accepting the customs union, and therefore it's very difficult to see any benefits from Brexit. But if we are going to Brexit, for goodness sake, let's have benefits. And it's clear that what she's arguing for can, however theoretically, give us benefits, but it's not clear now that what Labour's arguing for will do anything other than constrain us. So I think it is politically very successful.
And John Rentoul, let's move on to the Northern Ireland question. I mean, it seemed in the early part of her speech that that was one area that she was basically saying, this is a red line, we will have no hard border. And then later in the speech, she said, she made a reference to no borders of the past. I mean, what's your impression of where this whole Northern Ireland question has been left?
Well, she didn't add to it, to be honest. She didn't develop the British government's position at all. She merely reiterated her opposition to a customs union, which might be part of the solution to the Northern Ireland border question. And so she left it essentially unanswered, because, as you say, she said no, that there will be no hard border, but equally there will be no border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. And she hasn't explained how she's going to achieve that, except the magic of technology, which may be all that it takes in the end, but that is going to require some very heavy negotiations and risking the Irish government vetoing the whole thing.
Philip Blond, do you agree it didn't take us any further?
Well, sometimes if you try to take things further, you push them back. I think that if she gets into a political position with the EU where the Irish border is in essence the only issue that confronts them, then I think it will be solved. And we might have to create something even more strange and odd, like a particularity to the island of Ireland itself, which somehow then doesn't create a border in the Irish Sea and doesn't then create another border between the island of Ireland and the EU. But it's not beyond the wit of man to do this. So I think it's a bit like, don't go into Stalingrad right now. Let's get agreement on a whole range of issues. And then we have I think then the solving Ireland then at least becomes something which can concentrate minds and becomes possible. So I think it's not wrong in certain instances to leave the most difficult question in abeyance while you solve other things around it, so that you can create the conditions for what, in my view, will have to be an entirely bespoke deal for the island of Ireland itself.
OK, Philip Blond and John Rentoul, very good to talk to you. Thank you for your analysis there. Well, as you're hearing, the Prime Minister has set out her 5 tests for Brexit in a major speech setting out the government's agenda as it enters the next stage of negotiations with the EU. I'm joined from central London by Francis Grove-White, the Deputy Director of Open Britain. Francis Grove-White, good afternoon to you. What did you make of the speech?
Good afternoon. Well, I think it was disappointing, really. We were promised a series of 5 major speeches over the past 10 days or so by the Prime Minister and 4 of her senior ministers that were going to really shift the dial on the Brexit negotiations, which, as we all know, have become very, very complex and very, very stuck in the mud recently. I think what we got today was, just as with the speeches from Boris Johnson, David Davis, Liam Fox, was very little progress on any of the key issues, whether it's Northern Ireland, the customs union, how the government is going to avoid the huge economic cost of leaving the single market and the customs union. Really, this speech, unfortunately, didn't really address any of those questions.
But you say we didn't get detail, but she absolutely stuck to that red line. We're not going to stay in a customs union. But she talked in great detail, didn't she, about a customs arrangement?
Well, she talked about 2 proposals that the government put forward in a paper last summer, which have both really been dismissed, not only by the EU side, but also by experts here and leading figures in the government. I mean, one of the proposals that the Prime Minister discussed at length today, which I thought, frankly, was dead in the water, is a proposal for a customs partnership with the EU, which David Davis himself has described as blue sky thinking, and which leading politicians on the continent have just said is completely unworkable.
Well, what's wrong with blue sky
So there may have been detail, but there wasn't really any credible solutions.
What's wrong with being ambitious, Francis Grove-White?
There's nothing wrong with being ambitious whatsoever. The problem is you also have to be realistic, and you have to offer credible, serious solutions, and not just sort of twiddle your thumbs for a few months and then decide that you can come out and give a speech and regurgitate the discredited solutions that you put forward 9 months ago. I'm all for being ambitious. I'm all for, you know, we at Open Britain desperately want the best for our country. We're patriots. That's why we're constantly, day by day, pressuring the government to come up with some solutions. But it's not enough to just say we're being ambitious if those things that you're putting on the table are not realistic and are not going to be accepted in the negotiations.
Did she not strike a realistic note in saying that things are going to change and we both have to accept that we're not going to get everything we want, but this is what we want, and now come back to us and negotiate?
Well, I think, I mean, let's be honest, we're nearly a year to go until we leave the European Union. Today, on the issue of Northern Ireland, we had almost no new proposals from the Prime Minister. This is, as we know, an absolutely fundamental issue now and is threatening to stymie the talks entirely. We had no mention of how, you know, the Prime Minister made one of her red lines to protect the economy and protect jobs. Well, we saw a leak of the government's own secret analysis about the impact of Brexit a few weeks ago, and it showed that leaving the single market is going to hit our GDP by 5% by 2033. So we didn't have any solution today to how the government is going to amend the problems for our economy that come from leaving the single market and the customs union. We also didn't have anything in this speech about the NHS, which, frankly, given the promises that were made during the referendum about £350 million a week extra going to the health service, is frankly shocking. And I think people will be scratching their heads as to what this government thinks it's doing. It's completely sold every promise that has been made. Seems to just be thrown on the trash pile.
I mean, you're saying that she didn't give enough detail, and yet the EU's response to this from Guy Verhofstadt is that we've actually got more cherries on the cake, that she's asking for more and more and more here. Isn't that what we want?
Well, it's all well and good to ask for more and more and more, but you also, like I keep saying, you have to be serious and make credible proposals and actually come forward with solutions. We as a country voted in the referendum to leave the European Union, and the government is now trying to negotiate that. But this idea that it's, you know, it's the EU's prerogative to come forward with suggestions for how to make the Northern Ireland border situation not turn into a complete disaster.
Didn't she say on that that it was still to be discussed between the Irish government, the UK government and the EU as well? They would all get together to discuss it.
Well, yes, I'm sure there will be. Of course, there's much more negotiating to be done, although, again, let's not forget how much the clock is ticking now. There's supposed to be a deal by October, which will then need to be ratified. So the time is running out. But there was an agreement reached on Northern Ireland back in December, as your viewers will know, which the government has then rode back on over the past few weeks. We've not only had people questioning whether the agreement that was reached is binding, we've also had this week, for example, Boris Johnson coming out in a leaked letter to the Prime Minister. We see that he doesn't see it as the government's duty to protect the soft border in Northern Ireland. He thinks it's, you know, that wouldn't be the end of the world. That's not what we were told during the referendum. Boris Johnson said very clearly during the referendum there will be no change, absolutely no change to the situation in Ireland and with the border. And, you know, what we've seen over the past few weeks is ministers rowing back on that, just like they've rowed back on just about every other promise that was made during the referendum.
Francis Grove-White, we're out of time. Thanks very much indeed.
A delicate task to get these two sides to not be affronted by this speech, but for now at least the Prime Minister does appear to have achieved that. Not the case, however, as you might expect, in terms of the opposition. Jeremy Corbyn has said that Theresa May has still, despite setting out what she claimed was a detailed and pragmatic and credible set of suggestions, he said it was anything but.
I think there'll be judged as yet more confusion on the road to complications. What we need is a set of objectives which means that we can protect jobs in this country, and that when the Labour government, hopefully elected at the next election, is there and is able to end the mess of the internal market in our public services and not go down the road of the kind of trade deals that Liam Fox wants to do.
Now, of course, aside from the domestic reception, the key is also how it goes down in Europe and in Brussels. And I think we can hear a bit more about that from our correspondent Mark Stone very soon.
Tom, thank you.
Now, our other main story tonight. Theresa May has outlined her vision of Britain's future relationship with the European Union. She repeated the UK would not be part of the EU single market nor customs union, and said both sides would have to accept hard facts and that no one will get everything they want. She also warned that the UK would have to pay money into some EU agencies to maintain access to them. Our political editor Laura Kuensberg was watching the speech.
Roll up, roll up. A hot ticket for a certain kind of audience.
Looking forward to the speech.
Ministers and diplomats arriving for a speech.
Can you unite the party, sir?
That will affect us all. Oh, and it matters to her survival too. With controversy never far away. The first message, no more promises that after Brexit we can have it all. To trade just as we do now or be completely free from the European courts.
I want to be straight with people because the reality is that we all need to face up to some hard facts. We're leaving the single market. Life is going to be different. In certain ways, our access to each other's markets will be less than it is now. So we need to strike a new balance. But we will not accept the rights of Canada and the obligations of Norway. The second hard fact is that even after we have left the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, EU law and the decisions of the ECJ will continue to affect us.
Out of the single market and the customs union, she confirmed. Yet no new answer to one of the hardest parts.
We have been clear all along that we don't want to go back to a hard border in Ireland. We have ruled out any physical infrastructure at the border or any related checks and controls. But it's not good enough to say we won't introduce a hard border. If the EU forces Ireland to do it, that's down to them. We chose to leave, and we have a responsibility to help find a solution. But we can't do it on our own. It is for all of us to work together.
More details on how she wants much of the economy to stay close to the EU, but the Prime Minister wants the right to pick and choose when and how.
The Commission has suggested that the only option available to the UK is an off-the-shelf model. We both need to face the fact that this is a negotiation, and neither of us can have exactly what we want. The fact is that every free trade agreement has varying market access depending on the respective interests of the countries involved. If this is cherry-picking, then every trade arrangement is cherry-picking.
Last, an answer to claims her plans are too vague and unreal.
My message to our friends in Europe is clear. We know what we want, we understand your principles. We have a shared interest in getting this right. So let's get on with it. Thank you.
Do you accept now that we can't have it all as we leave? And secondly, you've outlined today you want to pick and mix, even though the EU has repeatedly rejected that approach. What is it, do you think, you can say to your EU leaders that will actually change their minds?
I'm confident that as we come and sit down together, we will be able to show that mutual interest and mutual benefit from the proposals that I've put forward.
After weeks of internal Tory wrangling, the Prime Minister has made gathered Tory grandees content.
This is about finding a way through that will work for everybody.
Why have you spent so long saying we can have everything? You said we could have the exact same benefits today.
I said that's the aspiration, to get the exact same benefits. The point we're aiming at here, and one of the things the Prime Minister said very, very clearly, is that we want to have a complete tariff-free arrangement. That's very good. We want to have mutual recognition. All of those things, not just in our interest, they're in Europe's interest, and that's why we'll get them.
What happens if the European Union says no to all of this?
I think the invitation that was made through the speech that the Prime Minister made was to apply a cool head to some very important mutual problems but also opportunities.
An outbreak of Tory unity? The Foreign Secretary was grounded by snow but gave a thumbs up, and Brexiteers and Remainers followed suit for now.
Hello, Governor, can I just ask for a very quick word? Were you happy with what you heard?
Others, like the Bank of England Governor, less keen to give their verdict. The opposition unimpressed.
I think there'll be judged as yet more confusion on the road to complications. What we need is a set of objectives which means that we can protect jobs in this country.
Number 10's pressed its case with some more detail and more realism than before. That could make a difference to the next steps of this lengthy tangle. But there are plenty of audiences making demands of Theresa May, who will still demand yet more.
Well, we'll speak to Laura in a moment. But first, let's talk to our Europe editor, Katja Adler, who's in Brussels. So, Katja, how did the speech go down there?
Well, Fiona, the reaction here in Brussels has been rather muted and wary. The EU's chief Brexit negotiator, Michel Barnier, took to Twitter to thank the Prime Minister for her clarity and to say that confirmation that the UK would be leaving the single market and the customs union meant that it was heading for a free trade agreement with the EU. Privately, EU diplomats have praised the Prime Minister's more realistic tone, they said, admitting that both sides can't have exactly what they want, but they said they couldn't find much new in her speech, and they lamented the absence of a workable solution, they said, to the Irish problem. Manfred Weber, he's very close to Angela Merkel and a leader here in the European Parliament, he said the UK was still burying its head in the sand. So tonight we've got working groups from all the 27 EU member states who are poring over the detail of the Prime Minister's speech. One diplomat said to me today he hoped that he would find coded messages to the EU in Theresa May's speech that would then become much clearer once they sit down again at the negotiating table. He said something similar happened with her last Brexit speech back in autumn.
Katja in Brussels, thank you. Well, Laura in Westminster, was there enough detail in the speech and enough in it to keep the different factions of the Conservative Party happy with it?
Well, for today, yes. Probably for this week, yes. In the medium and longer term, well, nothing is guaranteed about the Conservatives staying on the same page over Europe. Warning the party and the public that compromises lie ahead is not the same as them swallowing those compromises when it actually comes to them being agreed. But I think most importantly today for number 10 was the message to the European Union that while Theresa May has no intention of being a pushover, she does now recognise very publicly that the UK cannot get everything its own way, that there will have to be compromises, there will have to be sacrifices. And in terms of what the British government wants the message to be, that was absolutely crucial. They believe that is what the European Union has really been after in the last few months. They hope that by the end of this month, there'll be a test that proves positive at the crucial European summit. And they hope at that point that all parties will be able to agree the transition, the implementation phase. But, you know, in terms of keeping the EU and her party on side at home, it is an almost impossible task for Theresa May. Today's speech has been warmly-ish welcomed by those in her party, but it doesn't mean that the longer-term contradictions or the longer-term arguments have gone away.
OK, Laura, thank you.
And later in the programme, a wintry day for the Winter Paralympics flame ceremony. Closed to the public because of the weather conditions, but thanks to superhuman efforts, the torch event at Stoke Mandeville Stadium did go ahead. Now, you can't always get what you want. That's the central message of Theresa May's vision for Britain's future trade relationship with Europe. As she said, the country had to face up to some hard facts about leaving the EU. Speaking at the Mansion House in the City of London, she appeared to make some concessions, admitting that the UK would have to pay into some European agencies, for example, while Britain would have less access to European markets than we do now, she admitted. But she also expressed confidence that she could negotiate a better free trade agreement than any which currently exist. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, reports.
Piece of cake?
Shall I get a free piece of cake?
Pro-EU demonstrators handed out cake to ambassadors attending the speech. EU leaders have accused Mrs May of trying to have her cake and eat it, quitting the EU but continuing to enjoy the trade benefits. EU leaders say Mrs May's negotiating red lines have made her idealised vision of trade access unachievable. Today, she acknowledged some downsides to leaving.
I want to be straight with people, because the reality is that we all need to face up to some hard facts. We're leaving the single market. Life is going to be different. In certain ways, our access to each other's markets will be less than it is now.
But Theresa May is hoping for top-of-the-range access to the EU, even as Britain leaves the customs union and the single market, because Britain starts with the same standards, and even if we want to regulate things from Westminster, we intend to stay much the same as the EU on rules and regulations after Brexit.
We will need a comprehensive system of mutual recognition. The UK will need to make a strong commitment that its regulatory standards will remain as high as the EU's. That commitment in practice will mean that UK and EU regulatory standards will remain substantially similar in the future.
But the EU's own red lines separate the two sides here. The EU believes mutual recognition of standards comes with membership of the EU institutions, including its court. Mrs May suggested a blurring of one previous red line of her own. The aviation, medicine and chemical sectors might sign up to most of the EU rules and pay for the privilege, but others wouldn't. And some sectors, like digital technology, might diverge from EU rules and lose access.
If the Parliament of the day decided not to achieve the same outcomes as EU law, it would be in the knowledge that there may be consequences for our market access. And there will need to be an independent mechanism to oversee these arrangements. The EU has varying levels of access to the single market, depending on the obligations those neighbours are willing to undertake. What would be cherry-picking would be if we were to seek a deal where our rights and obligations were not held in balance. And I've been categorically clear that that is not what we're going to do. We have a shared interest in getting this right. So let's get on with it. Thank you.
Throughout her speech, Theresa May warned individual EU member countries that putting up barriers to trade could harm them as much as it could harm Britain.
Theresa May was openly calling for
add-ons, additions to the basic free trade agreement model that the EU normally uses. And she was trying to appeal to individual member countries in the EU, hoping that they will help her push back a bit on the EU rules and the rhetoric of its leaders. Theresa May talked a lot about the pain that countries could experience if they go ahead with too brutal an agreement. Are you trying to talk over the heads of the European Commission and the Europe bosses to the individual 27? And are you quite sure you know what their pain threshold is when it comes to breaking up the single market?
I'm not talking about pain thresholds. I just spent the last week going around a very large number of them. The people who make the decision on March 23rd is the European Council. That is the member states. They're the people who are going to make judgments about their own interests, what their own industry will do, what their own citizens want.
And you think they're in a different place from Jean-Claude Juncker and Michel Barnier?
I think they're going to make a decision which is going to be to the benefit of Europe and to our benefit as well.
Ambassadors who listened to the speech were cautious afterwards. You don't think she's trying to have her cake and eat it still?
I was offered the cake by Open Britain at the entrance and I ate it.
That's a very diplomatic,
very
diplomatic reply. From Michel Barnier, the EU chief negotiator, a curt tweet. I welcome your clarity about leaving the single market and the customs union and your recognition of the trade-offs. The European Council will draw up its negotiating guidelines for a future free trade agreement accordingly. He completely ignored Theresa May's elaborate description of a middle way approach. She's hoping it falls on more fertile ground with the member states, and fast.
Well, Gary's in Westminster now. Gary, now that the dust has settled on the speech, what do you make of it?
Well, I think the key next moment is the guidelines that are being drawn up in Brussels, and we'll be able to pass a bit of a verdict on it when we see those. Could be the first part of next week, because what Theresa May wants is the EU 27 to allow some wriggle room in these guidelines that allows them to engage with the apparatus that she was unveiling today. And she's asking them to engage with something, as she said, that goes beyond any trade agreement in the world. And she's asking for the best possible terms that Europe has ever given anyone, just as Britain potentially sort of waltzes out the door. I think in political management terms, what Theresa May has done here is negotiate the softest possible hard Brexit given the red lines that she herself had put down there. And in the course of doing this, she's been kind of squeezing down the Brexiteers a little bit in her cabinet. But if the EU come back, either straight away next week or over time, and start pushing Britain towards a leaner Canada-style free trade agreement, well, then the question will rather turn onto people like Philip Hammond in the cabinet. What are they willing to tolerate in terms of what they would consider thin gruel like that? And then, of course, that's without factoring in another bit of the Brexit political pinball. What happens if the House of Commons votes for a customs union? And then that pinball goes spinning right round in the other direction.
Indeed. Gary, thank you very much. Well, earlier I spoke to the Environment Secretary, Michael Gove, and I asked him what concessions he'd made in the negotiations on Brexit.
Well, I think what we've got here from the Prime Minister is a very pragmatic approach towards our negotiation, which ensures that the manifesto commitment and the referendum vote are honoured. We're going to be outside the single market and outside the customs union, but at the same time, in order to ensure, in particular for manufactured goods, that we have the best possible access to the European market, we accept that we could be associate members of a variety of regulatory bodies, of agencies, and that's a pragmatic approach.
So you didn't want that? That's what you've had to give up?
No, I wouldn't say that I have given anything up. Well, I wouldn't say that it was something that I didn't want. I think what it is a recognition that when you're developing a free trade agreement, by definition, it's a negotiation.
But if you haven't given anything up, then you've won. The Brexiteers have won.
Well, we won the referendum, and the mandate to leave the European Union is now being followed by the government. And at the last general election, both principal parties, both Conservative and Labour, said that they were going to honour that mandate. Labour have moved away from that now. But the Prime Minister is keeping the promise that she made with the British people.
But the Prime Minister said neither side can have exactly what we want. You've got exactly what you want, you've just told me.
She made the point that in any negotiation between a sovereign country like Britain and the European Union over a free trade agreement, neither side can have perfection by definition. Neither side can have absolutely everything all its own way. And the Prime Minister was clear that there were some hard choices, not just that Britain, but that Europe had to face as well. And
but the Brexiteers in the Cabinet have not made any hard choices, you've said. You're perfectly content with what you've got.
Yes,
I'm just asking you to name one compromise you've made.
Well, it's not for me to reveal or to discuss exactly what goes on in cabinet discussions. All I will say is that I'm absolutely delighted by the position that the Prime Minister outlined in her speech today. Michel Barnier said that he thought that this was a constructive speech. So, again, it's entirely possible for people to look at it and say, if I had my way in a perfect world, I would have had a notch here or a tickle there that was different. But actually, I think it's a sign of good judgment on the part of the Prime Minister that the pitch that she's making to the EU is seen as realistic by them and approved of by people across the Conservative Party.
Last week, when you, the Cabinet, discussed the road to Brexit, there was this incredible sort of Cluedo-style picture of you all in the Great Hall and checkers. Did you decide to plonk yourself one side of the Prime Minister and Boris Johnson the other, or was that all arranged for you? Was there a seating plan?
No, there was. As far as I know, there was no seating plan, no. I think it was just we plonked ourselves down depending on when we arrived in the room.
Oh, so the two sort of big beasts of the Cabinet sort of surrounded the Prime Minister?
Well, I'm only really a big beast in the Cabinet in terms of being, you know, slightly heftier than some other members of the Cabinet. So in physical terms, I suppose, in terms of a voix de poids, yes, I am big, but not in other respects.
You're the first politician to say you're not a big beast.
I'm not a big beast.
I mean, does that mean, then, staying on the subject of big beasts, that you and Boris Johnson are no longer writing secret letters to the Prime Minister, basically bossing her about on what to do in Brexit?
I don't think anyone is capable of bossing the Prime Minister about.
When was the last letter the two of you penned together on Brexit to the Prime Minister?
We write letters, and of course, by definition, Cabinet correspondence should be confidential, to our Cabinet colleagues all the time.
To the Prime Minister specifically, personally?
And to lots
For your eyes only, I think it...
Yes, one of the striking things about a Cabinet government is that so much of it is carried on by correspondence. That's the way in which you share information and ideas.
Theresa May set out what she called the hard facts for Remainers, and one of those was that, well, hard facts for everybody, but
Indeed.
One of the hard facts for Remainers was that the UK will be outside the single market. Less access, she was absolutely clear,
Yes.
to our biggest trading partner. Isn't that rolling back free trade?
No, it's not. One of the things about the approach that the Prime Minister put forward today is that she's talking about a deep and comprehensive economic partnership, a deeper free trade agreement between Britain and the European Union than that which the European Union has with any other third country.
Well, Donald Trump has said that trade wars are good and easy to win. I mean, do you think America would crush us in a trade war?
No, I don't think so. And I think one of the things about the particular domestic constituency that the American president is talking to at this time in the electoral cycle is that, you know, saying what he's saying about steel and aluminium makes sense politically. More broadly, however, the president said, in fact, he said to me that he wanted to secure a good trade deal between America and Britain. Again, in that trade deal, not everyone will get everything that they want, but there is goodwill and a desire on the part of American politicians to make sure that we can have freer trade between the US and the UK.
But you interviewed him. Do you
Yes.
still keep in contact with him? Do you have any to and fro with him?
No, I interviewed him. I haven't had the chance to revisit the conversation since then.
Do you get the odd message from Rupert Murdoch about what's going through Donald Trump's mind?
No.
That was clear. Theresa May set out her road to Brexit today. And running through that vision was this idea that basically she does want to do a pick and mix option.
Yes.
The EU, the European Commission, has said that's absolutely impossible.
Well, they've said on one hand that you can't cherry pick, and then on the other hand, they've also said you can have a free trade deal, but you need to be on a level playing field in regulatory terms as well. So they are also saying that they want a pick and mix arrangement. Now, that's not a criticism, that's just a recognition of reality. If you want to be outside the single market, then you can't have the same access as being inside. But if you do want to, and we do want to, maintain a broad level playing field in terms of regulation, then we can go significantly beyond free trade agreements of the kind that Canada, Japan and South Korea have.
If the deal, well, the deal is going to be put to Parliament.
Yes.
Shouldn't MPs get the right to say, that's not the deal they want, we want to have a second referendum?
No, I think that having a second referendum would be hugely disruptive and disrespectful because to the British people, damaging to democracy. In that referendum, people were told, this is it. Whatever you vote, your decision will be respected. If politicians said, you know what, we know better. We politicians, we've had a look at this, and you poor deluded voters, you got it wrong. Think again. I think that would do damage to our democracy.
If not a second referendum, though, what about a free vote on the final deal, as Sir John Major was advocating? What have you got to fear from that?
Well, I think that...
I mean, apart from losing.
Well, my view is that the majority of people in the House of Commons respect the referendum result, want to see it implemented...
Well, put it to the test,
and want to see that. Well, one thing I can't do and shouldn't do is to advise the Prime Minister or the Chief Whip of the Parliamentary Conservative Party on the handling of these issues.
But you personally would have no objection to a free vote?
Well, no, my view is that the Prime Minister is negotiating in good faith on behalf of the country in order to ensure that the decision that a majority of people voted for, both at the referendum and in the general election, is implemented. I always listen with interest and respect to what any former Prime Minister says, and I would not want to say anything disobliging, but on this occasion, I respectfully disagree with John Major.
The most senior former top official at the International Trade Department has said that we're exchanging a three-course meal for a packet of crisps. What do you make of that?
I think a lot of people who voted in the referendum would have thought to themselves, you might have been enjoying three-course meals when you were a permanent secretary, but I'm afraid the reality of life for the rest of us was somewhat different. So we're grateful for your vivid metaphor, but we'd like you to respect the democratic decision that we made.
So post-Brexit, it's a gourmet offering?
I think post-Brexit, instead of having to have, if you'll forgive me, the table d'hôte that the European Union insist on, then we can dine à la carte across the globe.
Michael Gove talking to me earlier.
Well, the terrible weather here blew the PM temporarily off course. A planned trip to Newcastle to make her big speech on Brexit was scrapped, and she stayed in London instead to deliver it, with a dose of cold realism to boot. The Prime Minister admitted that in a negotiation you don't always get what you want, and that life will be different out of both the customs union and the single market. It does at least seem to have averted a crisis in her own party for now, with Remainers and Brexiteers almost on board. But out in the EU, some of the key players, notably the Irish PM, have been more sceptical.
Insulated against the cold and her many Brexit critics.
Will Brussels buy it?
Who are across the Channel and in her own cabinet. Here she was in the heart of the City of London, setting out, more than 20 months after we voted to leave the European Union, how she sees our future commercial relationship with our most important trading partner, the EU. And she tried to assure the rest of the EU she's a realist.
I want to be straight with people, because the reality is that we all need to face up to some hard facts. We're leaving the single market. Life is going to be different. In certain ways, our access to each other's markets will be less than it is now.
Now, she stared down the Brexiters in her own party who say we can and should have literally nothing more to do with the European Court of Justice.
Even after we have left the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, EU law and the decisions of the ECJ will continue to affect us. But where appropriate, our courts will continue to look at the ECJ's judgments as they do for the appropriate jurisprudence of other countries' courts.
She repeated that there was no existing trade deal that could serve as a model for her. But that didn't mean, as EU negotiators have charged, that she's having her cake and trying to eat it.
If this is cherry-picking, then every trade arrangement is cherry-picking.
And when the going gets tough, so will she.
Yes, there will be ups and downs in the months ahead. As in any negotiation, no one will get everything they want. We will not be buffeted by the demands to talk tough or threaten a walkout.
But perhaps the area where she was least confident was over her two options for making sure a peace-threatening hard border doesn't re-emerge between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland.
Now, I recognise that some of these ideas depend on technology, robust systems to ensure trust and confidence, as well as goodwill. But they are serious and merit consideration by all sides.
Her proposals included superior rights for UK citizens to live, study and work in the EU, and reciprocal rights for EU citizens to live, study and work here. Paying to rejoin European agencies that set the rules for the safety of aircraft, medicines and chemicals, and committing to keep to high safety, competition and labour standards for the goods we make, so that our manufacturers have maximum cheap access to the giant EU single market. But some will see all that as continuing to be too much under the sway of Brussels.
What can you say to those people who voted for Brexit was the point of Brexit?
Yes, as I said in my speech, there will need to be some binding commitments, as there are in any trade agreement. In any trade agreement, you sit down and you work out what rules both sides are going to operate on, particularly on issues as I've said in here, on competition and state aid. That's what we'll be doing in negotiating this trade agreement.
What's so special about aviation, medicines, chemicals that we're prepared to be a rule taker in those areas and not others?
The point is they're very heavily regulated, very structure intensive. So without a regulatory structure, there is no aviation, and similarly in some other areas. On chemicals, the point there is you've got a very stable set of rules already, which the industry depends on. So there are issues which we judge to be in the national interest.
There was mixed reaction across the Channel. The EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, said he welcomed her speech and its new clarity. His equivalent in the European Parliament, Guy Verhofstadt, complained she was trying to put a few extra cherries on what he called the Brexit cake, while the Irish Premier, Leo Varadkar, said he still wanted to see more detailed and realistic proposals. She hopes she's revealed enough of what she wants so that the rest of the EU will at last start those important trade talks. It would be the beginning of the most important journey she'll make. Robert Peston, News at 10.
Mrs May had a range of key groups to win over today, Remainers and Brexiteers in her own party, the Northern Irish MPs who are keeping her in Downing Street. Our political correspondent Carl Dinnan heard some of the reaction.
Theresa May's vision of our future partnership with the EU had to balance the demands of different constituencies. Her declaration that life is going to be different was welcomed as an admission by the opponents of Brexit on her own side.
Even on the best case scenario as she paints, this optimistic, I fear slightly unrealistic, special arrangement and special deal with the European Union, our country is going to be worse off. And I think people really need to look at this now and say, those who voted leave, is this really what I voted for?
And those potential rebels who want to keep Britain trading inside a customs union say they won't drop their demands. In fact, did the speech contain, as we were promised, any more detail?
I think will be judged as yet more confusion on the road to complications. What we need is a set of objectives which means that we can protect jobs in this country.
But others around Westminster were much more impressed with the Prime Minister's proposals, in particular her vision for trade relationships which allow the UK to change the rules in future pleased the all-important Brexiteers in her party.
When we're a sovereign state once again, if it works for us to be aligned, say in the aviation sector as she was talking about, then that's great, and we want to maintain that because we're talking about this deep and special relationship. For that very reason, it works well now in many ways. What we want to be out of is that EU oversight. We want to be a sovereign state.
So what about the problem of you-know-what? Mrs May's proposals for the Irish border were both complex and not all that new, but she has satisfied the people who keep her in power.
She's talking about a customs partnership. She's talking about the UK administering the external tariff, which would avoid any kind of customs barriers between the UK and the rest of the EU, including Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic.
And of course, staying in power is what Mrs May has to do to get to the next big Brexit job, negotiating all this with the EU. Carl Dinnan, News at 10, Westminster.
And in from the cold, Robert Peston joins me now. So, fiendish balancing act for the PM, not least because of this pressure that really built up over the last 7 days. Did she pull it off, do you think? And has it bought her some time?
Well, look, any day in which she's not savaged over Brexit is a good day for her. She was sufficiently vague to keep the Brexiters in her party on side for now, but I think when they look at the detail of what she's proposing, they will become a bit more uncomfortable. Why should we be, they will say, a rule taker from Brussels in aviation and chemicals, and medicines? I mean, they will fear that this is the thin end of a wedge, and we will see pressure from those who want a closer relationship with the EU pay off, and she'll give ground on other areas where we will not take back the ability to make our own laws. Similarly, across the Channel, among the negotiators, they are delighted to have at last some kind of a window on what she wants, because 20 months after we voted for Brexit, they were genuinely getting very, very unhappy about not knowing where to go. But what I don't yet know is whether she has gone far enough towards what they regard as the sort of building blocks, so that in just a couple of weeks' time, when they set out the guidelines for these trade talks, there is something really there that we can negotiate on. I mean, the worry would be that she's bought a bit of time, but we haven't really seen significant progress.
OK, Robert, thank you very much indeed for that. A few hard facts, a bit of soft fudge, and a warning to everyone they'd have to compromise. Theresa May was speaking today to her own sceptics as much as she was speaking to the naysayers of Europe. If everyone or no one ends up happy, then perhaps her job is done. The tone today was markedly different from a year ago. Then she promised us the same benefits in terms of free access to trade. Today she warned starkly that life after the single market would be different. Less sunlit upland, perhaps more hard graft. The cake has not so much been eaten as ground up into crumbs, and now we're trying to squeeze them back together into something that resembles the right offering. As for the Ireland question, Theresa May suggested the border would be as frictionless as possible. We'll explore what that means later. She offered herself as a pragmatist, putting options on the table. Will Europe's negotiators bite? Here's our political editor, Nick Watt.
August, thoughtful, though at times perhaps a little intimidating. Peering down at Theresa May were grand figures from the ancient world, a reminder, if one were needed, that the stakes are high. Today, Theresa May set out her vision for the UK's future relationship with the EU at the Mansion House in the City of London. Criticised for indulging Brexit supporters, the Prime Minister issued a warning that they may not be entirely happy.
I want to be straight with people, because the reality is that we all need to face up to some hard facts. We're leaving the single market. Life is going to be different. In certain ways, our access to each other's markets will be less than it is now. How could the EU's structure of rights and obligations be sustained if the UK or any country were allowed to enjoy all the benefits without all of the obligations?
So a warm reception there for Theresa May from the city elite, who've just sat through a speech which did mark a marked change in tone from the Prime Minister. For months she's tiptoed around Brexit supporters, gently suggesting there will be challenges they will need to accept over Brexit. But today she set out what she described as a series of hard facts they will have to accept as she negotiates Britain's exit from the EU.
Those hard facts about Brexit are: European law will still have an effect in the UK. Leaving the single market will have an impact on the economy. No take-it-or-leave-it approach on the Irish border. And making binding commitments to remain in step with the EU in some areas.
David Davis, can I ask you, are you going to have to use all your renowned skills as a diplomat to sell these hard facts to your fellow Brexit supporters?
No, I don't think so. I think the simple fact is, I mean, you go ask Boris, go ask the other Brexiteers in cabinet, if you like. But what the centre of this is that Parliament will always have a say. Today, the rules come down from the European Union. Parliament doesn't really have a proper say. This time, they'll have a say, and they'll make that say. They'll exercise that say in the knowledge of the consequences, one way or another. Will this give us access? Will it not give us access? And that's what a free country will do, and that's what will deliver the best outcome for Britain in the long run.
Lest any Brexit supporter fear that today marks betrayal, the Prime Minister warned the EU that it too needs to face up to hard facts. Her fundamental vision for Brexit also remains unchanged: out of the single market and customs union, and no direct say for the European Court of Justice over the UK. These are balanced by a call for the UK to forge the deepest possible partnership with the EU, possibly including associate membership of some of its regulatory bodies. Brexit supporters gave the speech a guarded welcome.
So Anne-Marie Trevelyan, can I ask you, if you were Prime Minister, is this the speech you would have given?
It was a very pragmatic speech. Would I have given this one? I'm not sure. I'm not in that position. I haven't had to plough through these, incredibly complex sort of, departmental de-wranglings to see where we sit and what it looks. But I think, yes, it was a very pragmatic speech talking to our European partners.
Remain supporters were unimpressed.
What strikes me is that we're almost 2 years on from the EU referendum and the Prime Minister is still trying to hammer out the details about what leaving the European Union actually means. And what struck me today was the focus wasn't on negotiations with the Commission, wasn't on getting the best deal, wasn't on protecting public services, but was trying to hold that fragile coalition together in the Conservative Party, which is being led around by the hard right.
Sparse. That has been the EU complaint until now about Britain's vision for its future relationship with Brussels. Today, Theresa May filled that space.
Well, that was Nick Watt, and we did ask the government for a minister to evangelise for Theresa May's speech. Nobody was available. Brussels was rather more forthcoming. The Vice President of the European Parliament, Mairead McGuinness, joins us now. Thanks very much for your time this evening, Mairead McGuinness. This was quite conciliatory, wasn't it? Did you find it a pretty reasonable pitch, something that you could work with?
Well, I think I'm glad the speech was made, and I think it's a lengthy speech that needs to be studied, but it had many audiences, and I think that's perhaps the most interesting point of this. Much of it, I think, towards the Conservative Party, and I'm glad that there's some reality dawning in the Brexiteers and indeed within the Cabinet as to what leaving the single market and customs union actually means. I think it needs further analysis, but on balance, I'm happy the speech is made. There are many areas that I remain very concerned about. I do worry that the United Kingdom wants to jump ahead of where the negotiations are at. Of course, we need to know what framework of a relationship we will have, but I'm also concerned that we haven't agreed a withdrawal text at this stage, nor a transition period, and we now have this speech. And I've always been minded to say that while speeches are important, particularly in terms of the political climate in the United Kingdom, they're not negotiating documents.
Okay.
And they don't match what we have at the EU level, so we will need a negotiating document.
But I just want to get down to the specifics of the speech, because she talked in detail today about, for example, the Northern Ireland border, wanting to make it as frictionless as possible with technology and goodwill. Does that ring the right chord for you?
Well, I don't see much change, really. I do welcome the acknowledgement that there will be no hard border. I think that was very important. To some extent, I regret that it's necessary that this has to be said. But I would add a little bit of concern that this is not just a transactional issue on the border. We're not dealing with a normal border, if you like. This is a border which has history and geography and politics behind it, and there is a peace agreement that is international. And I would be concerned about the idea that we can have small firms trade as they are today and large firms do something different. I think that misses the entire point of why we in the Republic of Ireland, and this is shared by our EU partners, are so concerned that there will not be a difference to the relationship we have today. So I would like Theresa May to think a little more deeply, about the consequences, because our shared membership of the European Union has facilitated a situation where even the nationalist community can accept that they are part of the United Kingdom because they're free. We're all within the same space, if you like, single market customs union, and life continues. Even with what's in the speech today, for somebody like me who travels through Northern Ireland all the time, there could be an impact because of checks that may happen along the way. So I'm trying to move beyond the idea that this is just an infrastructural or lack of issue. It's about the psychological impact. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there.
OK, let me take you on, Mairead McGuinness. Sorry, we don't have long. Some of the other things that she was talking about was, for example, the associate membership of some of the EU agencies. Is that something that the European Parliament, that the EU would welcome?
Well, I think that's being pushed by industry in the United Kingdom, and I'm very glad to see, for the first time, very concrete realities again dawning in the United Kingdom, that leaving regulatory agencies will impact on business in the United Kingdom and patients. And while there are countries like Norway are part of many of our agencies and are valued, have a good relationship in those agencies, if the United Kingdom wants that, there is a price to be paid, and I think the Prime Minister has acknowledged that, and there is a value to be gained from that as well. I would hope on those issues that we could make progress, but it will be part of an overall package. And remember that the red lines are still very heavily red, leaving the single market and customs union. And there is then a sense, having laid out those red lines, of saying, but on the other hand, we actually like what the EU has created in a whole range of issues. And as I read this, it is a bit like saying, look, we want to be part of the European Union, but we don't want to be called being part of the European Union.
On that note,
so
we'll leave it.
Let's hope that it can move things forward. And if it does, I welcome that.
Thank you very much indeed. Appreciate your time. Sorry to squeeze you. Joining us now, the committed Conservative Brexiteer, John Redwood. I just want to pick up on Mairead's point there. It feels like we're saying we want to be part of the EU, but we don't want to call it the EU. It's everything but in name.
I don't think she's understood the speech, and I think the speech was primarily aimed at the European Union. The Prime Minister rightly ended by saying, let's get on with it, and that was a message to the European Union. Because one of the problems is this ridiculous idea that you have to negotiate something called a withdrawal agreement first, before you can go on to discuss your future partnership.
Just let me bring you on to the vision in the speech then, because this was a very different vision, wasn't it? To become associate member of agencies, to carry on paying into those parts who want to belong, carry on using and having to have a relationship with the ECJ, the need for compromise. Does that work for you?
I don't think it's new at all. I think that was there in the Lancaster House speech and in the original ideas that the Brexiteers had.
Not this idea that we'd be associated with all the different bodies of agencies of medicine, of chemistry, of aviation.
For example, during the referendum campaign, we often said that something like Erasmus, which is a programme for students that goes beyond the EU anyway, is the kind of thing which, if there were sensible terms for doing it, why wouldn't we carry on?
It's not a regulatory agency, that's a sort of exchange programme, isn't it? I'm just asking whether you find that contradictory to what you felt you were getting.
No, not at all. But it would have to be.
No.
But it would have to be very clear that it doesn't put us under the control of the EU, and that if there is any payment, it's a proportionate payment to the cost and would save us money setting up our own body. Because our other option is just to set up our own body to do exactly the same thing, and we would need to evaluate one against the other. But it's very much
it's not exactly
very much a third order.
Whistle, though, is it?
It's a very third order issue. No, you're trying to make problems where there aren't problems. I mean, the problem the EU now has is that every time the UK government puts forward something decent, often very generous, they just throw it back in our face, and they have no serious interest, it seems, in negotiating a free trade agreement or a wide-ranging economic partnership. And they have to understand the British people are getting mighty fed up with this. And why would we want to be at all generous over their so-called withdrawal agreement if there is absolutely nothing forthcoming? I hope for the Prime Minister's sake and for the country's sake, they read the speech again, realise it was asking them to engage seriously now to have a comprehensive agreement.
They think she's got her head in the sand.
Because there is no way the British Parliament of people are going to sign up to their withdrawal agreement, that dreadful draft they sent us, without there being something really good on the end of it.
So when you say there's no way, that you think there is still a no-deal option on the table, do you? Because a lot of people thought she was moving now towards compromise. She was saying it's going to be tough. It wasn't the speech that she made a year ago in March when she said we will have that continued.
Well, I think the EU is moving very strongly to no deal because, as you've just heard in that interview, which is very representative of EU responses, everything the Prime Minister has generously put forward or has positively put forward is too little, or they don't agree with it.
So you think no deal is still the most likely outcome?
If they don't change their attitude, then of course we end up with no deal.
You wouldn't mind that?
There has to be a... Well, I've always thought that no deal gives me 4 of the 5 things as Brexiteer I want. It means we don't pay them any money. We can spend all that on our priorities. We can have our own trade policy and do our own trade deals.
Is she wasting her time then?
do you not want to hear all the advantages?
Well, I understand. No, I understand.
We can make our own laws and we can control our own borders. The only thing we don't get,
I've heard that.
The only thing we don't get is the free trade agreement. Now, would we like a free trade agreement? Yes, and I think it's mightily in their interests as well. So a deal that is better than no deal is, of course, possible. But if the EU is not prepared at any point to say, yes, we want a free trade deal, then these talks are going to be very difficult.
So do you think Theresa May's red lines have gone now? I mean, when she talks about the need for compromise and the need for hard facts and choices, do you think that those red lines have been eroded now and it's up to the EU to start moving towards us?
I think the Prime Minister has been extremely friendly and generous and positive towards the EU, and she wants now some response, and the country needs a response from them. Otherwise, there won't be a deal. And I don't think she's eroded the key red lines, no, because she's made very clear, as the EU used to be very clear, that you can't stay in the customs union and single market if you're leaving the EU. And she's made it very clear that we want our own independent trade policy, which you can't have in the or a customs union. I don't think a customs union exists. And all the things Mr Corbyn wants are clearly not negotiable. The EU would say no to the lot of them.
We will take that on with our panel. John Redwood, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for coming in. Of course, the speech Theresa May made this afternoon had an eye on her European audience, reminding those we're leaving that it's also in Europe's best interest to keep relations as smooth and as close as possible. Is that how Europe sees it? The first tweeted responses from the EU negotiators suggested not. And as Mark Urban explains, the response is unlikely to be unified.
I am afraid that the UK position today is based on pure illusion. It looks like the cake philosophy is still alive.
The warning was clear enough. Don't try to cherry pick. Yet that's exactly what Theresa May did today. Why? Because many in Whitehall don't quite believe the EU's rhetoric, thinking it's a negotiating stance and that some countries want to put business ahead of dogma. Those closest have the most integrated economies with the UK, but for the moment, France and Ireland in particular are taking a tough line on Brexit issues. Further afield, the V4 or Visegrad group, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic and Slovakia are critical of the Commission and favour a softer line on Brexit. Some of the Scandinavians also favour a conciliatory approach. But who to lead this bloc of Brexit moderates when Germany in particular argues the EU's rules must be defended vigorously?
Quite a lot of member states, to a greater or lesser extent, would like a broader relationship, a deeper relationship involving more economic activity, more trade investment between the EU and the UK. However, the British should not, in my view, get too excited about these nuances around the 27, amongst the 27. Because although a lot of governments, as I said, would like a broader relationship than that which Barnier seems to be pushing for, the French and the Germans in the Commission are very powerful, very dominant.
So what are the chances of a champion emerging to challenge the Germans in the interests of keeping trade with the UK sweet? Probably quite slim. Why indeed should any country want to organise others in the UK's interest? But if there's one possible pragmatist in chief, it's Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, who's just today questioned the federalist ambitions of some in Europe.
The European Union is not, in my view, an unstoppable train, speeding towards federalism. Brexit shows that the EU is not an irreversible certainty. In many member states, political parties, at the centre-left, the centre-right, parties with a long-standing European tradition are under pressure.
The European Commission tonight praised Theresa May for at least making clear that she wanted a free trade agreement rather than a version of single market membership. Now the work will begin on seeing just how ambitious they can be about that trade deal.
That was Mark Urban. With me in the studio, the finest Brexit panel you can imagine. Ian Dale, Nina Schick, Paul Mason and Suzanne Evans. Very nice of you to come over and chew over the stuff we haven't yet tackled. We have Brexit Remainers right and left, as you can see. And I will give the first panellist the response, who tells me tonight they do not feel compromised by what's been offered today.
I don't feel compromised by it.
Took a pause, but go on.
I only paused because when I watched the speech, I'm going to be honest, I found it quite difficult to follow. It was very complex in some, very detailed, lots more detail than we've had in any of her other speeches. And it's a speech that you kind of have to read a couple of times before you really get it. And I think when you have the Irish government, Michel Barnier, Jacob Rees-Mogg and Chuka Umunna all finding something positive out of it, I think she's probably done something right.
And you fit yourself then in the sort of frame of mind that says, yeah, she's ticked the right boxes that she had to?
I am not a dogmatist. I've always believed in any negotiation there will always have to be compromises, and for the first time she came out and said today, yes, there will. We won't be able to get all that we want. And yet up to now, it's been, yeah, we will be able to get everything we want. It'll be frictionless, it'll be quite the same, just a different structure.
Are you there, Nina?
Well, this is the most interesting thing from my perspective about the speech, is that reality is hitting the government in the face really hard. If you look at Theresa May's first speech at Conservative Party conference in 2016, the famous, you know, Citizens of Nowhere speech, and then Lancaster House in Florence when she asked for a transition, at Lancaster House when she said that the UK would be leaving the customs union and the single market. Today she admitted for the first time, and this is, of course, from my perspective as an EU analyst, something I've been saying since 2016, that there have to be trade-offs, there have to be compromises. This magical
So you were
dream
glad that she said that?
Yes, and I think the EU will also welcome that. Nonetheless, there are still problems. The most fundamental issue, in my view, is that the issue of the Irish border has not been resolved. We've seen the massive kickback in this country to the draft withdrawal agreement that the EU laid out, because they suggested that the fallback option for Northern Ireland, which has to be underpinned in law, because the EU is an international treaty organisation underpinned by a rule book, would be that Northern Ireland remains in the customs union or the single market. Of course, the UK said that's not possible. I completely understand why Theresa May said that, but what is the solution? So this customs partnership that she put out today, what does that actually mean? We don't have enough detail on that.
I want to spend time on the Irish border, but before we do that, Suzanne, just come to you. Do you hear a woman or a leader who has had to compromise, who's had to get rid of her red lines now? Is it the Brexit you want?
Some of it's the Brexit I wanted. We had a clear commitment today to leaving the single market. We had a clear commitment to leaving the customs union, and a customs union, in an absolute snub to Jeremy Corbyn, quite rightly. We also, of course, had strong commitments on an end to freedom of movement. But there are other things in it that she didn't lay down strongly enough. The idea that we could walk away with no deal, that now seems to be off the table. She talked very strongly about the European Court of Justice in a way that was almost treating it like a benevolent grandfather, saying that we needed to listen to it, that we would take advice from it. That's not exactly the position that we wanted either. And I'm particularly worried about what she said about fishing, because for us in UKIP, you know, fishing was one of those real red lines. Fishing industry is the one that's been absolutely destroyed, perhaps more than any other, by our membership of the European Union. And to hear her talk today about our shared stocks was a massive indication, I think, that she's going to use perhaps fishing as some kind of bargaining chip with the European Union. And so our fishermen will not get the rights that they would have under international maritime law, which would be an absolute disgrace, really.
Well, Theresa May just effectively applied for off-peak membership of the European gym. Except she wants to pay for the treadmill and the sort of skipping rope, but not the weights and the spinning class. And we remains to be seen. They're glad she's made an application, and we'll find out what they think about it. But look, I think John Redwood there, in your interview with him, is deluded. To be honest, I wish he was still sitting here, because the point I would make to him is that the fantasy of hard Brexit just evaporated, number one. Forget an independent fishing industry. We're going to give Europe full access to our fisheries.
And
all of that,
that's my
excuse
point.
me.
We should not.
That's what she's just offered. And to be honest, he talks about the will of the people and what the British people will put up with. There is clearly no majority in the UK Parliament for a customs union, and the moment they put that vote to a vote, I think we'll find out that she's actually negotiating from a very weak
But when
and
you're saying that hard Brexit
position.
has evaporated, you're cheering that, are you?
Well, I think we should just do a job for the viewer to try and explain what has happened before we unleash our own particular prejudice on it. I'm against a hard Brexit. I want the softest possible Brexit. I want customs union. I'm glad Corbyn has gone in the direction of trying to negotiate closeness to the single market. The other thing that evaporated, let me say, is David Davis's promise from 2017 that we would get the exact same benefits.
Yeah.
And that's been just shown to be a fantasy. On the doorstep, that's very, very powerful for people like me, Labour campaigners,
Why
who
would
be
you
able to
accept that?
say that. Accept what?
This idea that actually, you know, everything that was promised, that the trade benefits were all going to be the same, that the uplands were going to be there. Why would you not have a problem with that
still
now?
will be there, and to say that the idea of a so-called hard Brexit, which I think is actually just Brexit, has evaporated is ridiculous, because we are still going to leave the single market and we are going to leave the customs union. Those were what the soft Brexit used to describe as a hard Brexit, but no longer do. And I think it is a great thing that we now have another divide in British politics between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. And we heard from Jeremy Corbyn on Monday, and he outlined very clearly what he wants to do, but he knows that he can't deliver it because the EU will never accept Britain at the negotiating table for new trade deals if we're still in a customs union.
Are you closer to the Corbyn view of Brexit?
No, absolutely not. Corbyn's view of Brexit is a total and utter fudge. I mean, it's completely unachievable.
Why is it any different? Why is this, union different to an arrangement or...
Well, I think actually Theresa May spelled out very clearly in her speech today why Jeremy Corbyn's version of a customs union simply won't work. I think the problem that we've got is that Theresa May is still, in a sense, negotiating from a point of weakness. She's still listening too closely to her advisors, people like Jeremy Hayward and Ollie Robbins, who are, really don't want to come out of the European Union at all. Expert Remainers, absolutely. And she's not actually telling the EU strongly enough what we want. At the end of her speech today, she started to actually sound like she was a woman who believed in Britain, who believed in the Brexit cause, but most of
were all over this
didn't.
speech because it kind of backtracked on what they agreed at Chequers, where the politicians said we're going to have regulatory divergence, and all she talked about in this speech was more alignment.
Right.
The one other point I'd like to make is that I think there is a mood out in the country for people to just get on with this and get it over with. And I think I had quite a lot of people on my phone in today saying, look, give the woman a chance. We like the speech. I might have voted Remain, but actually, give her a chance.
So we're talking as if it's up to us now. It's not. It's down to Europe, and it's down to whatever the divided voices in Europe now say.
We're still a long way away from the future trading relationship. Let's not forget that we first of all have to get that draft withdrawal treaty text agreed. And the UK, by the way, despite all the anger at the EU's draft agreement, hasn't put forward their own. Then we have the issue of the transition. And I know that Theresa May has sold this as an implementation phase, but that is, of course, not the case, because the idea by March 2019 that you can have an FTA ready to go is simply diluted. It's not going to happen. So then the next question is, can hard Brexiteers accept? And what I found really interesting in our discussion here is that given that what was promised and what Theresa May said today, everyone seems to think, there were good parts in that. It's not at all what was promised, right? Jurisdiction of the ECJ or not, whether or not direct. And the same will be the case for the transition.
I guess my point now is that if there is at least some sort of overlap between what people broadly want, does the EU hear it in that way? I mean, you've already heard from Barnier and we've heard from Weber saying she's got a head in the sand, and Verhofstadt saying it's all vague.
They're always going to say that, aren't they? No. I mean, Verhofstadt and Weber are the two most Europhile politicians in Europe.
Well, they are Europhiles because they're fully bought into the project.
Federalists,
well, what I would say is that federalism or not, the centre in Europe knows it is in trouble. Okay. Now, I read this as a gamble by the British Foreign Office. Actually, I see the Foreign Office hands on this as well as Ollie Robbins, etc., because they've been doing a lot of bilateral talking to European capitals. They see the gamble is the European centrist project is in so much trouble that they will allow what Britain has asked for, which is a specific bespoke free trade deal, and go around the Commission position, which is to offer us either Canada or Norway.
I think the problem is that we perhaps in the Vote Leave campaign underestimated the ability of Brexit and the civil service, the government and civil service, to actually deliver the Brexit that the people voted for. And I think what will ultimately come out of this today is I think the EU will just see Theresa May as another bit of a pushover, and they'll just push back even harder.
Thank you all very much. Thanks for coming in.
I've been getting away